Okay, I think we're live, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Environmental Tracts Buck Creek Project and Historic Bridges, Laws and Policies session. I'm Mike McGregor from Bacon Farmer Workman Engineering and Testing, and I want to thank you for joining. As we get started, I'd like to introduce the presenters for this session, who are Michael Leathers and Tom Springer. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, gentlemen.
All right, thanks, Mike. I'll be presenting first, and I'm going to share my screen. All right, you all should be seeing my screen here. I'm going to be presenting on the Buck Creek Project. The official name for this is the Kentucky 80, Kentucky 461 interchange. It's located in Pulaski County, District 8, near the city of Shottville. H&B was the primary consultant to do the Phase 1 and Phase 2 design, and we also were in charge of the environmental process. We followed it through from the NEPA document through the permitting process, and we had CRA on our team to handle the cultural resources. Just to give a little bit of history on the project, Kentucky 80 and Kentucky 461, they're both rural arterial roads on the national highway system. They're vital connection, providing access from I-75 to the city of Somerset, Cumberland Parkway, and the recreational area of Lake Cumberland. 461 is the north-south movement here. It ties to I-75 up in Mount Vernon, and then ends at Kentucky 80. Kentucky 80 is the east-west movement going from London to Somerset. So the idea for a project originally began with the I-66 corridor study that looked at connecting London and Somerset. This was back in the early 2000s. They had a DEIS in 2006. Part of that project was a Kentucky 80 461 interchange, but the FEIS was never completed for the project, and obviously it was not constructed. Another project that is related to this is the Somerset Northern Bypass project, where they had a EA FONSI was approved in 2004. The EA FONSI did not reference Kentucky 80 461 intersection, but it did reference the I-66 corridor study, and with the plan that the bypass would be converted to I-66 if ever constructed. Another aspect to this project is that the right-of-way was purchased for the Northern Bypass. So it has not been constructed yet, but they do own that right-of-way. All that kind of brings up to the project we have today. Kentucky 80 461 interchange is how this project began in early 2018 as a scoping study, looking at that intersection, looking at potential options to converting that grade intersection to a grade separated interchange. The traffic analysis found that the intersection was operating at a LOS F level service. There were 74 accidents within that 5-year study period, so it was a high accident rate. And just the knowledge that the vehicles were having a hard time making the left turn movement. As you can see, Kentucky 80 is 4 lanes of traffic. It has the offset left turn movement there. So trucks, especially semis going to industrial areas, and trucks carrying boats going to Lake Cumberland, had a real tough time with this left turn movement. At the time for this Kentucky 80 461 interchange, the proposed project we configured had an initial and ultimate configuration. The initial would just handle the movements that are out there right now, and the ultimate configuration would allow for the tie-in to that Northern Bypass project that I mentioned. So that's how it all started. Late spring of that 2018, two big changes occurred. One was to the design of the project. Two changes for the design were implemented. One was just north of that intersection to the Valley Oak Industrial Complex. This area generates about 2,900 jobs for the area. It has a lot of semi-trailers, obviously, coming in and out through all periods of the day. It has an at-grade intersection, of course, so we're looking at another grade-separated interchange. Traffic analysis showed a level service F. There were 16 accidents at the time, but which isn't as many as the other interchange, but it was well known that the same problem occurred. Trucks were having a hard time finding ways to make that left turn on the 461. KYTC was aware of this. They had some projects back in 2012 to add left and right turn lanes, but the safety issue remained. It didn't actually solve the problem they had there. So another thing to point out was that the businesses in this area, in this complex, were very supportive of the project, and they were included throughout the design process. So the other design change that occurred was the widening of 461. It's the way to tie these interchanges together. The project was proposed to widen about 4.5 miles of 461 from a 2-lane to a 4-lane. The widening would begin at Kentucky 80 down at the intersection that we previously discussed and would go up to Buck Creek. Now, as everyone's probably pretty well aware, Buck Creek, it's a pretty significant stream. It's designated as outstanding resource water. It's a reference reach stream, and it's an exceptional water. And then on top of that, it also has critical habitat for 3 listed mussel species, 2 that are federally listed, 1 that's state listed. So that was obviously something the team was aware of whenever we started discussing the widening of 461. So obviously we did not want to impact the stream if we could prevent that. We did not want to impact it. So we looked at the bridge. It had a sufficiency rating of 85.6, status of not deficient. So we felt like we could stop prior to that. And it also has a couple miles from the industrial park that allowed the trucks to integrate into the flow of traffic. They could gain speed, get integrated. So we felt like there was a good stopping point for the project. And then just to go through the purpose and the need of this project that we came up with. And the purpose is based off the growth from the industrialized development that's occurred along 461 and along with the tourism at Lake Cumberland. So that growth has resulted in increased traffic, particularly the truck traffic, like I mentioned, and it's causing mobility and safety issues. So the purpose of the project was to enhance regional mobility, improve the safety, reduce congestion within the roadway network that connects I-75, Cumberland Parkway, Hal Rogers Parkway, and the Lake Cumberland recreational area. So the other big change that occurred in the spring of 2018 was that the project became a candidate for the Bill Grant. So once that occurred, part of the grant application is to show that you can meet the timeline that was required. So to meet that timeline, we had to plan for a mid-2020 construction letting. That doesn't give a lot of time for design and environmental and right-of-way phases. So the schedule that they came up with was to begin preliminary engineering and environmental in July of 2018 and have the environmental NEPA document completed in July of 2019. So we had a year to do the environmental document. But as you see there, something that happened a little bit out of the norm is the right-of-way phase got pushed up. To have, at least a year, a little bit longer than a year to purchase the right-of-way, to get the utilities relocated, we had to move that phase up. So that all started in early 2019. And some of that early work was ongoing during the same time as the NEPA process was finishing up. And they got the good news later on that year in 2018 that the project did receive the Bill Grant. So they will be receiving $25 million there for this project. So we went and developed several alternatives. The alternatives mainly focused around the interchanges, providing a couple different options to look at. And what they the district and the project team went with was a cloverleaf design at the Kentucky 80 461 intersection. 2 ramps would be built in the initial configuration. Those are what you see in red. And then 2 ramps, these black, the lines here, they would be in the ultimate configuration that would provide the tie-in to the northern bypass. One thing that is significant with this design is that you see is the through movement changes. It's no longer Kentucky 80 and it becomes the Kentucky 461. So that was a big change with that interchange design. And then for the Valley Oak Industrial Complex, for the preferred alignment on this one, we chose a photodiamond interchange. And as you can see, there's not a lot of room to the north. You have the industrial facility here, the factory with the road with several access points, limiting what we could do on that side. And over here, there's actually a cemetery right here. So we were limited on the north, which really made this photodiamond interchange a good option for the project. What it does is it flips those 2 northern legs to the south, and you get two-way roads on the south side of the overpass. What this does is give right in, right out access to 461. So it takes out those left turn movements that were an issue for the trucks. Then for the widening of Kentucky 461, obviously, like we said, we stopped it just prior to Buck Creek. And really the widening was fairly simple as we try to stay along the existing alignment. We didn't do much shifting of the alignment. And we just tried as much as possible to stay within the existing roadway. So when it came to the environmental process, we worked through that. There was, relocations. There were a couple of historic houses, nothing out of the ordinary except for one thing, and that was the stream impacts. Obviously, we knew that the Buck Creek was at the northern end with the critical habitat, and anytime you have that, your ears perk up, and you got to make sure you take that into consideration. But we knew that we avoided all direct impacts of Buck Creek, but we also knew we were impacting the watershed. And this watershed, the Buck Creek watershed, has some of the most pristine water in the state. There's numerous sensitive species of mussels and fish. So this was all something we were aware of ahead of time. But as we went through, we found, there were 2 perennial streams that we were going to be impacting. The first one is Big Spring Branch. And you can see it's being impacted here by this ramp construction. It's a perennial stream that drains approximately 3 square miles. It converges into Flatlit Creek. And here's a picture of the stream. We were impacting about 1,380 feet of this stream. So not a small amount. As I said, that converges into Flatlit Creek, which is the stream here. It drains 13.8 square miles, and we were impacting 1,600. You can see the impacts here are broken up into 2 sections. We have a pretty long stretch right here, and then a little bit more over here, which there is an existing box culverts. I think it's triple box culverts right there that we would be extending. So there would be a little bit of impacts here, and then the long stretch right there. And there is a picture. You can see it's a good looking stream. It's got tree coverage in the area. It's spring fed. The temperatures were cooler in the water because it is spring fed and with that tree coverage. So these were all things that we found during our habitat search and evaluation of the project. So with those stream impacts and just the understanding, we brought this to the district and they were aware of it too. And we did a lot of early coordination about this. We didn't want these impacts, which, we saw as, because of the length of the impacts and the quality of the stream being in this watershed, we didn't want this to cause a roadblock to our project, whether it be scheduling or cost or, any sort of mitigation type requirements. So we went and we coordinated with the district, or we coordinated with our design team, we coordinated with DEA, and we even talked to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, did a little bit of early coordination with those guys to just discuss this, kind of see what we should do, see if this would be any issues. And in that coordination, we kind of committed to doing some natural channel design elements. We had several constraints that we were going to have to fit it within, but as applicable, we wanted to do some of these natural channel design within the project's footprint. Some of the constraints that we really were tied to is Barnesburg Road. You can see here is just to the north of the project. The disturb limits were already right up almost to the shoulder of that road. So we couldn't do a lot to the stream in this area, and that was a little bit tight. Another was the proposed right-of-way. As I mentioned earlier, the schedule had gotten pushed, and where some of the right-of-way was already occurring, at least the early evaluation, the look at I don't think they were making offers at the time, but just kind of that early environment right-of-way phase. So we had to keep that in mind. We didn't want to increase the right-of-way any more than necessary. Another aspect was the floodplain. That's what the shaded area is here. As you can see, it goes quite a bit up into this residential property. We didn't want to introduce a channel change that increased the impacts to that floodplain. So that was also in consideration. And finally, the project's in a rock cut. We looked at these streams and even considering their elements, they were in the bedrock, and much of the project was going to be in rock cut, which kind of limited some of the type of work we could do for the channel change. So that was another constraint. So what we came up with is this here. This is the channel change for the project. Zoom in, you can see that we have 100-foot ripple sections followed by 200-foot pool sections. We put in a 4-foot low flow channel. This would help make sure water was flowing throughout the year so that those species, mussels, fish, whatever that is in these streams could still traverse it even during low flow. Obviously, we put some slope protection when above the rock line. And then we got a proposed tree and shrub planting that we're putting back. Just try to replace what we are taking with the project. The picture I showed earlier, you saw it had nice tree covering. So we're trying to replace as much as we can. It's important to note, this was not a stream restoration project because of some of those constraints that we were dealing with. And the fact that this was not mitigation for the stream impacts, like that was going to be handled separately. So this was not a stream restoration project. This was just things that the district was committed to doing above and beyond just a typical channel change. Also, it's worth noting that this ramp here is part of the initial configuration, or the ultimate configuration, excuse me. It was not to be built now, but coordination with the highway guys, we knew that they had some extra material they need to waste. They needed somewhere to put it. We knew that we didn't want to impact the stream again 5 years, 10 years, 20, whatever, however many years down the road. We didn't want to have additional impacts to the stream. So we worked together, kind of came up with a plan. They're going to build this ramp, this ultimate configuration ramp now. Obviously, they're not going to pave it, put any of the gravel down, but they're going to at least build it, do all the earthwork for that ramp. And like I said, this was not done as mitigation for the stream impact. Mitigation is being handled separately. I think they are still pursuing a stream restoration project somewhere else outside of this project, but within the Buck Creek watershed. So what we did is we included the obvious plan, profile, cross sections. We also included several typical sections in the plan set. Here we had some typical ripple and pool cross sections that we included, and as well as some construction items, just helping the contractor understand what we're looking for with this natural channel design elements. So, all this channel change that we have here was really a result of great coordination between our environmental and design team, along with the district, along with DEA. And with that tight schedule that we were operating under due to the build grant, it was really required. A lot of this upfront knowledge, a lot of upfront coordination and communication was very important to keep this project moving, keep it on schedule, make sure that we were meeting all the deadlines that we had. to meet that build grant requirements. And we were able to do that. I mean, we had the CE document was signed on August 12th. That was, just 12 days past that expedited schedule, what we called for. We were able to get the BA cleared. It got approved in April 2020. There was a small revision to the concurrence letter in May, but that was just to cover a typo or something that in the original concurrence letter. The 404, 401 permit, we include all of that natural channel design elements in the application, discussed the reasoning for it, and all that went through great coordination with the court. So we got those concurrence letters and the 404 permit in May of 2020. Another piece to this that occurred was we had to do additional archaeology. The coordination that we did with the design team, we were aware pretty early on that they had done some things during phase 2 design that pushed the disturb limits outside of what we cleared in our NEPA document. One of the items that occurred was geotechnical recommendations had the slopes flatter than what was initially shown. That pushed our disturb limits out, pushed the proposed right-of-way out, and it went beyond the study area that was covered in the NEPA document. Same thing, similar thing happened with the right-of-way that was purchased for utility relocations. Coordination with Tom Klaus at QK4, who was overseeing the utility relocation, did the coordination with those companies. He and I talked, and they had several new places that they had to purchase outside of what we cleared. So we knew we had to evaluate these sites, and the only real aspect that it impacted was archaeology. So because of that early coordination that we did, we were able to send CRA back out early 2020, and they were able to get their SHPO concurrence in mid-May. So all the environmental documents that we were overseeing were able to meet that mid-summer letting date. Design, they did the same thing. They worked very hard. We're able to get all the design, all the right-of-way, everything was working smooth to meet that phase 2 or that letting date for mid-2020. And the COVID pandemic hits, of course, things got pushed back a little bit, but everybody's pretty happy to say that the project is in this month's letting and is scheduled to be completed 2023. So that's kind of a quick rundown. Like I said, I'm only at the beginning of this session, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. At KYTC, the central office, Ryan Smith is the PM for the project, and then Jamie West, of course, is the EC down in District 8 that had a lot of involvement. So any questions that you all have, we'll be glad to help. I don't see, doesn't seem like we have any questions, Tom. I will stop sharing my screen and let you take over.
Hold on. There we are. Hey, everybody. Finally got that unmuted. My name is Tom Springer, and I am going to be talking about historic bridges today. This is a presentation I gave at Bridge Day back in February. Hold on, I'm trying to click on my presentation here. Seems like years ago, back when that presentation was done, but it is an overview of the laws and policies and the decision-making process. It is completely different than Michael's presentation, but we're still sharing the hour, so I'm going to talk relatively fast as I walk through this and have obviously time for questions and answers at the end. I hope so. Back in Bridge Day, and the same today, the objectives of the presentation are to discuss 3 different federal laws that influence historic bridges. Most of us know two, but there's another one out there I'll present later on in the presentation. And when those laws apply, an overview of the process on how we make the decisions, there's a phrase from one of the laws that's all possible planning to minimize harm. And that is a takeaway. I hope that project managers and design leads take from this presentation and this talk, because that's sort of our marching orders. That's what we have to do. Talk about commitments and also talk about lots of examples with pictures, of course. So the first law that most people know of when it comes to historic bridges is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. 36 CFR 800 passed in 1966, and it is a process law, meaning that as decision makers, we have to follow a process. And if we're to be challenged whether or not we were compliant with Section 106, we'd be challenged whether or not we took the steps and followed the process. The outcome was dependent on the process. One of the quotes from the law sort of sets the stage here. It says, historic property significant to the nation's heritage are being lost or substantially altered, often inadvertently, with increasing frequency. And the goal with this law is to curb that and preserve our historic resources. So the question that's been asked a lot, and sort of get surprised sometimes at some of the answers I get, is when does the Section 106 apply? So I took a direct quote from the law. It says, prior to the approval or the expenditure of any federal funds or the undertaking, or prior to the issuance of on the undertaking or any license, shall take into account the effects of the object eligible from the National Register of Historic Places. So let's see. I don't know what happened in my polls, but I had a poll. If I can find it, I'll send it later. So when do the laws apply? In short, it's federal funds or federal permit. If you have a historic bridge over a stream, you're most likely going to need a federal permit. Therefore, almost always, these bridges have to undergo Section 106 process. Another question that I was surprised at some of the answers I get is, what is an undertaking? Well, that's pretty much anything. Rehab, replacement, inventory removal, really any federal signature or federal actions. I've had some people say, well, hey, if we're just rehabbing the bridge, then Section 106 does not apply. And that is not true. Rehabbing is indeed an undertaking if you have federal funds or federal permit. So the second law that governs historic bridges is Section 4F of the 1966 U.S. Department of Transportation Act. It's 23 CFR 774. You should, if you're not familiar with it, write that down and go look it up. It's pretty straightforward. But it is a substantive law rather than a process law, where it says you can and cannot do certain actions. So I'm going to read a quote here from the law. And my intent with this is to communicate sort of the scope of work that you have to take when 4F applies. So 4F has a programmatic agreement for historic bridges, and thank goodness it does. And this is a quote from that programmatic agreement. This statement sets forth the basis for programmatic Section 4F approval that there are no feasible and prudent alternatives to the use of certain historic bridges, structures to be replaced or rehabbed, back to that, applies to both, with federal funds, and that the project includes all possible planning to minimize harm. So I opened with the slide with the phrase, all possible planning to minimize harm, because that's exactly what we have to do. And we have to actually do the hard work and the analysis and the cost estimates and layout plans and come up with pros and cons on the prudent and feasible alternatives and make an informed decision. So a lot of times, very smart people and experienced people in this business look at a bridge and they're like, there's no way we can rehab that. I know what the answer is. We got to do this. And a lot of times they're right. But we still have to go through the decision-making process and document and look at all the alternatives, come up with the comparison matrix and the facts. And then, we end up where the person who knew what they were talking about said, I told you we'd be there. It's like, that's okay, because we had to document so that we're legally sufficient and comply with 4F. So quiz time here. And I don't have my poll in front of me, but Here we have a state-funded rehab project. It's just a deck replacement railing. You can see that at the construction on the top, and it's all state-funded. So does Section 106 apply? Sorry, I don't have my poll. I'm going to assume that somebody said no, and the answer is yes, it does. Because see this equipment in this pad in this stream, that is a permittable activity, and that requires a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permit, and with it, all of the federal laws and policies that govern our federally funded and federally permitted projects. So yes, this is a federally funded, requires a Section 106, even though it's state funded in rehab. All right, the 106 process, just real high level quick review. One thing we have to do is identify consulting parties. And that is engaging local landowners, local officials, local historians, and often these individuals have insight onto the historic resources that we're dealing with and have great solutions. And it can get a little messy sometimes, but if you really engage it, it's the process that can make a project really rich and do well. We identify not just historic bridge, but also historic resources surrounding the bridge. Is it in the historic district or a historic farm nearby? Of course, we assess the effects of our action on the historic resources and then work with the consulting parties and other people to avoid, minimize, and mitigate any adverse effects we might have. At the end of the Section 106 process, there are three possible findings that the state SHPO's office, State Historic Preservation Officer, will issue. A no effect, which is most of our projects. No, it's not historic, and there are no historic resources. We took a look, we documented it, we coordinated it, and it's no effect. That's most of them. If we have a historic bridge, the next best thing you can get is no adverse effect, and that is always our plan A. We always want to save and restore our historic bridges, but sometimes we can't, and we lose the bridge, and we get an adverse effect. That's plan B, last resort. We lose our historic resource. The phrase out with the old, in with the new applies, even though that is sort of our last resort, right? But that is an option in the process. But even so, even when we lose our resource, we still have to do all possible planning to minimize harm. And the way we do that planning is usually try to avoid, for example, if the only historic element is a stone abutment, can we pour concrete behind the abutment, a new abutment? If there are stone walls nearby, can we put the diversion or the new bridge away from the stone walls? Avoid historic buildings, or if there's railing, can we keep that railing? Or if we can't, can we minimize down to the point where there's no adverse effect, just rehab things or fix the railing, provide new members of a trust. I'll show examples of all these. And we engage our locals and our elected officials. I'll show examples of how we've done that, and that's helped us minimize or get a no adverse effect. And then we make commitments that we communicate through construction. When we have an adverse effect, our last resort, we have to have the documentation that we did all of our possible planning to minimize harm. We have to have an alternatives analysis to present to FHWA and for the file and to be legally sufficient. We really have to look at, new bridge on new alignment, or widening, or go left or right, or no build alternative, or rehabs, or different levels of rehab, and ask ourselves the question: what is the real purpose and need? Is this a major thoroughfare that needs unposted no weight restrictions, or is it barely used out in the middle of nowhere, leading just to a couple of houses? So what do we have to do to serve the traveling public? So we document our replacement. We have to keep all of our commitments the whole way through, and usually we have a memorandum of agreement signed by FHWA, SHPO, Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, and consulting parties as well. And of course, it's all legally binding. It needs to be carried all the way through. All right, so with some examples. First one you have is in District 1. I'm going to try to go across the state with different examples. This is a really cool old wooden trestle over a railroad track here, and it's just not feasible to rehab this bridge. And we're losing these types of bridges all across the state. But you just can't, put reinforced wood or bungee cords or duct tape like I would do to rehab it. So we're going to lose it, and it's out with the old. And we're going to build an efficient, new concrete, whatever the engineers deem appropriate. And then we will mitigate for that loss of the bridge outside of design and outside of construction. So another cool example is in District 2. We have this cool little 60-foot long pony truss. And we have a bridge like this where we are able to take it out of its setting and relocate it. We are required to market it and give it away. For this bridge, we put it out on Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of things, and we got 7 potential applicants, which was really awesome. Some really creative ideas on what different people wanted to do with this bridge if they could get it. We ended up picking a nearby city. They're going to incorporate it into their trail system. It's still a loss of the historic structure, so it's still an adverse effect, but it's part of our planning to minimize the harm and preserve our resources. We're able to repurpose this bridge in the next county over. In District 4 in Taylor County down in Campbellsville, we had this historic bridge, and what makes it historic is the railing. So what we decided to do was put back classic railing, which most people are familiar with. But through the consulting party process, when we engaged the city leaders and the mayor and the county judge executive and other people around, we came up with a commitment that we would remove these posts, and you can see that there are names inscribed there of the, past city council members or founding fathers of the city or something like that. We remove those and then give them to the city, and they are going to incorporate them in that little park that you can see on the horizon. So the point I want to make with this slide and this example is that it took a lot of work. We met on site, several phone calls and commitments, memorandum of agreement, and all these things. Or actually, we didn't have an MOA, but we had all these commitments. And it comes down to one little line on the plan set, number 3 here, out of a list of 20 or so. It says remove and salvage existing decorative rail post and basically give them to the city. So we're really putting a lot of faith in that sentence, that it gets the proper attention by the resident engineer, by the district, by the person overseeing construction, the inspectors, and the contractor to make sure this legally binding commitment gets carried through. In this particular case, I know it did because I know who the contractor was, and I called him up, and I called the city up, and sure enough, they got the post. And so it all got communicated like it was supposed to, but there's always this level of anxiety because it may be a year or longer before between when that commitment was made and it actually goes to construction. So here's another example in Jefferson County. This is a historic bridge, 1940 WPA. It's a culvert, poured concrete, a very clean, cool-looking bridge that the locals actually really enjoy, and we're really glad that we were going to preserve it. So we met with the locals and consulting parties and the SHPO and everybody, and we said, well, we're going to keep the head walls, and that's really the only historic part. And the only way we communicated that to the construction industry was a little note here, north head wall to remain, and then down at the bottom, south head wall to remain. And that was included in the plans. And then I'm happy to report that I went back out a few months later, and the bridge has been rebuilt. The deck has been poured and rebuilt. And there's new guardrail there for safety measures, as our safety people will be glad to know. And then the historic element of being the outside of that bridge did indeed remain. There's another bridge in Kenton County. This was actually the first bridge let for construction in the Bridge in Kentucky program. Is a historic bridge over an outstanding resource water. Had all the things going to make it complicated. The scope of work was to rebuild this deck, the railing and the deck. That's exactly what happened. Here's a picture after construction. If I have some historic-minded friends on this presentation, you're probably wincing at the color. Didn't pick out the color, but color is an important thing. And from here to forward, we're trying to always have either clear coating on concrete or just a concrete gray. But nonetheless, the railing was preserved per the plans, and we had a no adverse effect on that historic bridge. Here's an example over in District 7. The only historic part of this bridge is this really impressive stone abutment. The rest of the bridge, the other abutment, are pretty generic. But what you have to know about this bridge is that it's in a historic district. In the horse farm country, people are very passionate about historic preservation. It's an absolutely gorgeous area. So take it out of that context and you may approach this wall differently. But in that context, we made a strategic effort to redesign this bridge to barely touch that wall and put a new deck on it. Give shout out to Stuart McIntosh at Crawford for doing a great job on designing this and making sure the notes are in place that wall was to remain. But again, the communication is one note on a plan. And so, our goal is that the engineering side and construction side is aware that when these little notes get on these plans, man, they came from a lot of work, a lot of meetings, a lot of discussion of alternatives in an effort to stay compliant with the laws. And very important part of the process. So real quick, talk about historic railing. I love this railing. It's the Art Deco look, cool little windows. And anytime we talk about historic railing, our engineer friends rightfully should always bring it up that railing is not MASH test certified, and it is therefore a liability, and somebody's going to wreck and they're going to sue everybody. And that is a very legitimate claim. Sometimes, though, railing like this will end up at the end of the process remaining for the bridge. In this particular bridge down in Casey County, that is not the case. We're losing this railing. We're going to replace it back with Classic Rail because Classic Rail is MASH test certified and it is safer. This is on a 45-mile-an-hour road out in the country. And that railing there's barely any shoulder, maybe no shoulder, and it is a hazard. But if you took that exact railing and put it in a city, for example, or in a historic district, or at a stop condition, or inside of a park, the process may very well lead us to keep that railing. And from the engineering and the safety side, you should raise your hand and say, hey, that's not MASH test certified. That's not safe. And that information should be on the table. But also part of the process is we may end up keeping that historic railing, may have to have a design exception to preserve our historic resources for that context. So it's always context driven. And we run into that conversation all the time. Here's an example where we're going to lose this bridge because those really cool stone piers and abutments, which are, I think, WPA constructed, they've lost their integrity. They have huge cracks in them. But we met with the county judge executive and other people through the 106 process, and they said, hey, we would love to have these stones and fold them into our trail system in our park, which is about 5 miles away. So it's a great idea. So we ended up losing the bridge. We have an adverse effect, but through the all possible planning to minimize harm goals, we were able to keep and at least tip our hat and recognize the cool stones and the hard work that was put into these, and still make them part of our part of the local community down in Perry County. So, covered bridges. We all know covered bridges are historic and protected not just by Section 4F and 106, but there are other laws that protect them too. We all know that. I want to use this slide as a transition to talk about truss bridges. Because truss bridges are the new covered bridges. We are losing our truss bridges around the state. And in fact, a lot of well-meaning structural engineers and maintenance folks have a goal to remove truss bridges because they can be a lot of maintenance cost and a lot of work. But every truss bridge is historic. Every truss bridge is eligible, and every truss bridge must be approached with a historic preservation mindset and goal. Maybe you can't always do it, but that is definitely the goal that we should strive for. So when we talk about truss bridges, and we look at basic question of what is really needed, what is the transportation need for this project? What's on the other side? Is it just a house, or are we carrying a coal across of it? So once you understand that, you can do an alternatives analysis. This is what we've done in Bridging Kentucky. And an alternatives analysis, not left or right or new bridge or different types of bridges, but an alternative analysis is what would it take to increase the load carrying capacity to the next level. If it's at 3 tons right now, what can we do to get it up to 18 tons? Or what can we do to get up to 40 tons? Or what can we do to get it so it's no posting at all? And to document those different options and put costs to them. And sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. This particular bridge in Elliott County, Kentucky 32, is just half a mile to the left. Brand new bridge, brand new road, carries all the loads and vehicles you want. This bridge was one, they want to keep it. The cultural resource centers nearby, the county judge executive wants to keep it. So we're going to keep this and rehab this bridge, but it has a much less ton load carrying capacity than it would if it were full unposted was what was needed. So it was a good win on that one. Same down here in Laurel County. This bridge was currently posted at 19 tons, and through a super strengthening rehab project of replacing several of the members of the truss, especially underneath in various places, we're going to get it to no load posting, and it can carry whatever rating or whatever traffic across. So that was a great success story too. All right, third law I want to talk about that touches on historic preservation is not one that really affects people in the historic preservation world, or the SHPO or Department of Environmental Analysis or the historic consultants, but it's 23 USC 144, which is the National Bridge and Tunnel Inventory and Inspection Standards. This law governs a lot of what our bridge engineers do in terms of inspection, rehab design, and overall approach to maintaining our bridge structures. In the preamble of this law is a great write-up on historic bridges, and I think it's worth reading here. I think it really ties it all together. It says, Congress hereby finds and declares it to be in the national interest to encourage the rehabilitation, reuse, and preservation of bridges significant in American history, architecture, engineering, and culture. Historic bridges are an important link to our past, serve as a safe and vital transportation routes in the present, and can represent significant resources in the future. And that is so true. I feel a lot of times our approach as a whole is to find the most efficient and cost-effective means to meet the needs of the traveling public, and that is a great approach, and that is what we need as engineers and what we need on most of our bridges. But when it comes to historic bridges, we got to broaden out our thinking a little bit and realize that this bridge is part of our culture and part of our history and means so much to so many people. It's more than just an efficient transportation corridor. And I just love that language. I think it challenges us to think in the past, present, and future about preservation. I have a few examples on that as we round up here. So this awesome truss bridge here is in White Mills, Kentucky, in Hardin County, which is where I grew up. And as a kid, I went to White Mills Christian camp every summer. I played peanut league baseball, or at least sat on the bench anyway. Wasn't even good enough to play peanut or little league, but I was on the team there, and we would drive over this bridge. I can hear my mom's old LTD, probably weighed about 10 tons, going over that bridge and the wood bumbling underneath it. Scared to death. And now that I know what I know, I probably should be scared to death. This bridge today really isn't even needed. There's a brand new bridge just downstream, half a mile or so, and carry whatever you want over it. But boy, from a community standpoint and from a historic standpoint, this bridge is significant. I've had a bridge maintenance guy from District 4 area tell me that there are parts you can literally put your hand through. There's so much rust in it. But when you turn around, you come over this bridge and you drive straight, or walk straight maybe, what you see is the White Mills Christian Camp Hotel. And this hotel is very old and significant. I actually have a friend whose grandparents met at this hotel at a USO dance before her grandfather went off to serve in World War II. And they have a picture of them standing in front of this bridge. Obviously survived the war and had a family, and generations later, that bridge and that picture is significant, right, to them. But there's thousands and thousands of stories. And that's the vision, and that's the idea about our historic preservation, is to realize that how critical these are to our community. All right, so as a roundup, I'm going to show you a picture here. I have this print in my office. It's a painting by a man named Grant Wood. And Grant Wood is in Iowa. He painted American Gothic, right? Everybody knows that painting. This painting's called Still City. There's a lot going on in the painting, and what he's trying to convey is a change from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. Obviously, you see the farmland, but most of you probably already seen the pony truss here. And then to the left, there's a guy on a little horse, right, in the agrarian economy, and he's approaching the bridge to support the industrial economy. And back here, they've dug the mountain up and gotten all kinds of limestone, and that's what the city is known for. So for this presentation, I went online to see if this bridge from the iconic centerpiece of a Grant Wood painting is still around. And it's not. This is an aerial photograph of a new, still being girder standard, efficient, no load restriction, awesome, efficient bridge, right? I can assume, I don't know, that maybe this pier in the middle of the stream, or maybe the pier under that bridge, that red dot is, or part of that pony truss. I don't know. Maybe that pony truss was just in horrible shape and had to go. It's out with the old, in with the new, just washed down the stream, looks like a pretty big stream, fell apart. I don't know. Don't know the story. But I do know this, that it's gone, right? And when it's gone, it's gone. There's nothing you can do to get it back. Maybe this engineering and historic community worked really hard and did all they could to minimize and mitigate and all possible planning, or maybe they didn't. Maybe the engineering community or whomever just went in and replaced the bridge. I don't know. But it's a significant bridge, and we can't get it back. So I have one slide left. It is my recap slide about the takeaways. What does Tom want you to remember from his historic bridge talk? All right, preservation first. 'Tis the law. Decided to steal the name of the Kentucky Derby horse that I was hoping would win. But yes, preservation first is the law. Rehab or replace, my engineering friends, it matters not. It's federal funds or federal permit that requires you to follow the historic preservation laws. All possible planning to minimize harm is your marching orders. That is what we are to do. Out with the old and in with the new is indeed possible. As we've seen, it has to happen, but it's the last resort. Commitments are legally binding, and we have to carry those things all the way through. They're not suggestions. They're not just random notes on plans. They are things that have to happen. Trusses are indeed the new covered bridge, and they are all eligible, and we should work at preserving them. And we, environmental design consultants, consulting parties, public, FHWA, DEA, SHPO, we really do work hard to move projects forward, preserve our past, but it's all for naught without all of your help. That is the last slide I have, everybody. So I'm going to exit that. And if anybody has any questions, I'm not really seeing those, but hopefully if they are in the pop-up window, I will see them later.
Yeah, Tom, there are a couple questions in there for you.
Nope.
So can you hear me, Tom?
I can hear you, Michael.
So I assume everybody else can too. I had a question from Donna going back to my presentation. She asked how we started right away before an approved NEPA document. I should have clarified that we didn't actually make offers. They did all the prep work leading to that point, including appraisals. This job was pretty easy to do that on just because a lot of the impacts were the same. The interchanges impacted a lot of the same. The widening along 461 impacted a lot of the same property owners. So they did not make offers before that NEPA document. And then there was a CE3. That was your other question. What level? It was a CE3 document. Tom, you have a question from Brian James. He asked if a historic bridge requires a replacement to a piece of the bridge. Is that considered adverse? I guess you're answering, aren't you?
Yes, I see that now. And the answer is, of course, maybe. It has to be taken into context. At the best, it would be no adverse. It wouldn't be no effect because it's a historic bridge. But if it's the railing, are we going to just replace that in kind, or do we lose the railing? So it all depends. I've got examples where that very question ended with no adverse effect, and examples where it ended with adverse effect. I want to send my short maybe answered back. You mentioned about what sounds like insufficient on plans with a note. How would you suggest that have been addressed? Yeah, that it's out short of putting highlights and red flashing lights and big red arrows to that note. That's about as good as we can do. I mean, notes are notes on plans, but I think we try to include cap notes, which do stand out a little bit more, or special notes in the plans. Or anything there's something sort of random, like saving those